Welcome back to the Game Developers Library, a regular podcast about books for game designers and game developers, where I take a look through the back catalogue of literature on making games and other types of creativity and see what sorts of insights we can get from different authors that can help us to become better game designers and game developers. I'm Joe Baxter Webb. I'm a game designer and I run Indie Game Clinic, a YouTube channel all about reviewing and critiquing mid-development indie games. And my intention with the Game Developers Library was to have every episode be a interview kind of back and forth with someone who had recommended the book. I've had a cancellation this month, so I'm going to be reviewing this book on my own. And then from next month, we'll be kind of getting back into a regular cadence of having guests, and I think eventually I might be looking for a regular co-host, because my experience of listening to these kind of book club type podcasts is having consistent hosts can be really helpful, because they help you kind of thread the needle and relate, books or different theories to each other as you go along. So I'm doing this one on my own. I don't intend for that to be the format going forward. But let's see how we get on. So whether you've read Theory of Fun for Game Design before, or whether this is your first time kind of hearing about it, it is a interesting book that sits in a sort of strange position, because it sort of presents itself as an academic textbook, right? We've got the word theory in the title. We're going to be presented with a theory that's a specific type of use of language that tells us what type of book this is going to be. And I have quite a few criticisms of it in that area, but what I want to do is kind of put those aside for a minute for the first part of this discussion and just talk about what is good about the book, and generally try and just sort of objectively take you through what it covers and what we can still learn from it. Just over 20 years. The first edition came out in 2004, so 20 years after this came out. It's got some really kind of interesting people quoted in the introduction. We've got quotes from David Jaffe by God of War saying it's the best game design book he'd ever read. Lots of people saying, this is in my top 3 or top 5 books about game design and so on. And the afterword as well gives you some context that, just to jump ahead a little bit, in the 10th edition, Raph Koster is saying in the afterword, when he wrote this, there weren't many kind of celebratory positive books about game design at the time, in his mind at least. Yeah, to kind of take you through the content and the general argument here, if you think of what the title is saying, we're basically getting told we're going to get a theory of fun and what fun is. And that's going to help us to become better game designers, right? So you would think that this would be a book that kind of explains to you how to make games. And we get these introductory sections that explain why Koster set out to write this book in the first place. And the thing that immediately strikes me is we get this conversation with his grandfather where he's talking about, trying to explain to his granddad why making games is important in some way. And this is sort of rhetorical device that gets brought up at the beginning of the book, and we circle back round to it at the end as well. We get this kind of like, spoiler alert, we get this kind of like, oh, was it worth it spending my life making games? This kind of stuff. So it feels like a set of professional reflections from a creative person who has been making games for a long time and thinking about the ethics of what they do, why they do it, and is it worth it, all of that kind of stuff. So all of the kind of introductory section about why he's writing the book and why we make games and stuff like that, it's not necessarily geared towards, it's a book about game design, but it's a book about the purposes of game design generally, rather than how to do game design, I would say, is kind of a broad, it would give you a broad sense of whether or not you want to read this. Because we're not going to get in any chapters here about this is how you design a strategy game, or this is how you design an action game, or anything like that. We're talking very broadly about what fun is and how game designers are responsible for producing fun or allowing players to access fun. So we get this kind of personal introduction of how do I explain what I do to my grandfather, And then straight off the bat, for like the first couple of chapters, we're straight into how the human brain works and things like dopamine, and basically Koster establishing his theory of what fun is and why we experience it, right? So we end up in a space where we're talking a lot about kind of evolutionary psychology and how our brains work and all of this kind of stuff. And basically the notion that fun, or our experience of fun, is like a biochemical thing that happens to encourage us to learn. And that is kind of part of how humans work, is that, you know, we need to learn in order to survive, and our bodies have this wonderful inbuilt trick that when we are learning to solve problems or learning to match patterns, or all of the other things that all of the other skills that we test as we play games, we are sort of rewarded by our brain chemistry, and that experience is what we usually describe very broadly as fun. So that's kind of where we start off in this, is that Koster's theory of fun is really, what is fun and why is it? Why do we have fun? And it kind of takes us down this very kind of trying to back things up with hard science type stuff. And we get like a review of what a game is as well. We get that kind of philosophical discussion of what a game is, and we go through, you know, Sid Meier's description of a game as a series of meaningful choices. We get Salen and Zimmerman from Rules of Play saying that a system in which players engage in an artificial conflict defined by rules that results in a quantifiable outcome. And notably for me, Salen and Zimmerman are two of the only authors from early game studies who are really quoted in this book. There's one mention of Ian Bogost, but by and large, it feels like a lot of Koster's reference points are from broader art theory. You know, his background before he went into games is in literature and poetry, broader art theory, and then also kind of hard science stuff and stuff from evolutionary psychology. And it's pretty well researched, but also the book is formatted in a very strange way. So probably should have said this at the beginning, but like every other page we get a cartoon, and they're sort of the stuff of newspaper cartoons. You know, it's a little cartoon trying to illustrate a point, and there's a little bit of text under it that's hitting that point home. And they do disrupt the format of the book a little bit, because they often have you know, a kind of ... and then you have to turn the page to see the next point of the cartoon, and they don't totally match up with what's going on in the text on the opposite page. So there's a bit of a clash of formats here, where I sort of wish there was a version of this book that doesn't have the cartoons in. I know lots of people find them very charming, but I think I would have been able to judge the text on its own right a bit better if they weren't there. And part of me thinks, like, I don't know, one of the books I would love to cover in this series is Scott McCloud's book about understanding comics. And I almost wish that there was a version of this book that was done entirely as a comic, rather than this strange mix of like an academic essay and a comic book. And then another thing about formatting is we get all of these asterisks and footnotes, and then they are all endnotes in the book. So you get these very broad appeals to some particular scientific research or something, and if you really want to go and check it out, you have to jump right to the end of the book. So I find a lot of these formatting choices make this really kind of frustrating. I said I would save my criticisms of it to the end, but these things just jump out at me immediately in the first couple of chapters, because we really do take this sort of hard science stance to fun is just this evolutionary trick, and now we kind of have to live with the consequences of our evolutionary heritage kind of thing. We get to chapter 3, which is about what games are, sorry. And we get some interesting definitions of fun. So fun deriving possibly from a word for fool in Middle English, or fun, which means pleasure in Gaelic. He's talking about this being the release of endorphins into our system. Again, the relationship between this good feeling and learning. So in Koster's model, and this is one of the things that I think, I totally agree with. And if you think of this book more as his kind of personal, professional musings as a designer and him stating his design philosophy and his ethics, then I find that is a much more useful way to view it, because there is a lot of ethics in here about, what is good game design, what should game designers aim for, and what should game designers not aim for. And one of the things he talks about here is like, if you are sort of a power gamer and you finished a game and you play it just to feel good, even though you're not really learning anything, in his mind, that's a bad form of gameplay. The game has sort of outstayed its welcome. It doesn't have anything new to teach you, and you should really be moving on to play another game. So Koster is definitely in this camp of, game designers shouldn't be trying to build these 1,000-hour traps to suck people into and take their entire lives up with, and that's kind of a professional ethic that runs through the entire book that I totally agree with, and I think it's probably one of the stronger elements of the book. So we get a discussion of we get a small introduction of flow theory, and a game has a pattern. And as you learn the game, you come to recognize the patterns. And if you can't learn them quick enough, then the game is frustrating. If you learn them quickly and then nothing new appears, and it just takes a long time to access anything new or novel, then we would experience that game as boring. So he's taking this general idea of playing a game and learning a game as being about learning patterns, and sort of mapping that onto this idea of the pleasure of learning to do something. So we get through all of that, and then in chapter 4 we start talking about what games teach us. And he's not talking about explicitly educational games here, right? So there is a brief mention of gamification, and even in the original date of release of this in 2004, he's already rallying against what gamification has become now, which is, companies, usually very corporate companies, trying to make something fun by attaching XP bars and rewards and stuff to it, rather than making the thing inherently fun. So again, Koster is, in my mind, on the right side of history here when it comes to design ethics, and he has some pretty negative stuff to say about what gamification usually means. But in his mind, all games are learning. That is what a game is at its heart. Whether it's a game of like taking over territory or reacting to something, there's always some sort of pattern to learn, and that's really the kind of impulse, the human impulse that games are responding to, is this desire that we have to learn by understanding patterns. But we do keep dipping back into this very sort of Jordan Peterson-esque evolutionary psychology stuff that I just find, it's not that I disagree with it per se, at a kind of scientific level. I just find it incredibly reductive to kind of reduce humans to this kind of stuff. So we get sentences like this. So this is Koster on page 52. Given that we're basically hierarchical and strongly trimal primates, it's not surprising that so many of the basic lessons taught by our early childhood play are about power and status. Think about how important these lessons still are within society, regardless of your particular culture. Games almost always teach us tools for being the top monkey or tribe of monkeys. So we're getting into, like, again, this idea that we are stuck with a particular nature that comes from our deep history of evolution and learning to survive in the world, and that modern games sort of cater to that. I don't have any problem with that. I feel like I agree with it on some level, but there is just something very reductive about it. And we do get some pushback against this by the end of the book, which is kind of interesting because, again, in the afterword, we're told that he wrote this over the course of a weekend, right? So it is, although it's got this very linear structure where it's like, I speak to my granddad, I try and justify what I do at work, I explain what fun is, and then we step through all of these ideas about fun. It feels very structured, but when you think that it is a kind of stream of consciousness from Koster, there are some positions that seem to have sort of moved around a bit by the end of the book, because we get this kind of descriptive move to say, this is what games are, and this is why games are usually about competition and status and these various things. But then as we approach the middle of the book, we start to get a little bit of an inkling of Koster would like games to do more things than that, right? And this is kind of, if you've ever heard of Chris Crawford set up the Game Developers Conference, and he has this famous speech called the Dragon Speech. And even before that, he was experimenting with what he called people games. So, you know, we're talking about the end of the 80s here, I think. And you know, we've got games that are mostly about shooting little spaceships and stuff like that. And Crawford has already got sick of that and wants to make games about human relationships and stuff like that. So he has this famous speech where he goes on about Don Quixote and has a rant about Don Quixote, and then runs out of the Game Developers Conference saying he's going to go and slay a dragon. It's very amusing. One of the best conference talks anyone's ever given at any conference in the world. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is we have a culture of game designers who have sort of bought into the idea of games being these, you know, chess-like competitions of person against person or person against machine. And then at some point in their career, they're like, yeah, but what if we could do more with this? And that's kind of the Crawford position. And we get a little bit of that in here. But Koster is also, it seems a bit cynical about the limits of that. So I'll continue to work through the book in a chronological order. But we do have to jump ahead a bit because it's interesting to think about the overall arc of this book. Yeah, we get kind of a list of things you can learn from a game. So you can learn to aim. And then Mario is used as an example of a game that teaches you to explore. You know, and then we keep going back to this idea of these are all impulses that we needed when we were cave people. And maybe some of them are still useful now, and maybe some of them not so much. And we get like a cartoon of a cave person chasing a little car and stuff like that. And we get one of the things I think is particularly strong about this book that you don't necessarily get in other game design books is a lot of cross-referencing of games with other types of media. If you're not just listening to this podcast out of the blue and you know me from other places and my design teaching, I'm always relating games to music and games to other media, because I often feel like people have a better understanding of those things. People have a lay understanding of music that is way higher than their lay understanding of games. Like if you ask someone which part of a song is the intro or the chorus or something like that, they would have some sort of, there's a base level of cultural understanding of music theory that just doesn't exist for game design theory. So we've got a paragraph here on page 64 that's kind of going in that direction. So in some ways games can be compared to music, which is even more mathematically driven than games. Music excels at conveying a few things, emotion being paramount among them, but as a medium, it's not very good at conveying things outside of its sweet spot. Games also seem to have a sweet spot. They do very well at active verbs, controlling, projecting, surrounding, matching, remembering, counting, and so on. Games are also very good at quantification. So, I kind of like this because we're resisting the urge to try and force every medium to be everything, right? We're saying music can do this set of things, make people feel these ways. Games can do this set of things, make people feel these ways, and so on. But I think one of the things that we've skipped over, and it doesn't actually come in until later in the book, is how Koster feels about story and the relationship of story to games. Because the model that Koster is presenting throughout this book is a very sort of classical formalist idea of games, where when I say a game, I mean the sort of rules of the thing you play. So in this kind of model, if you play a video game and there are cutscenes and a story and stuff, those are part of the video game as a piece of software, but they're not playable, so they're not actually a game. They are sort of a decoration around the game. So we sort of skip over, well, we don't skip, we avoid that question for quite a long time because we stay in this sort of abstract land of talking about chess and platformer games and stuff like that for a very long time in this book. And then we only really deal with the issue of of games with stories much deeper into it. Yeah, so we get a list of things that games teach us that are maybe not things, that are not helpful things anymore. So for example, teaching us blind obedience to leaders, teaching us rigid hierarchies or binary thinking, teaching us the use of force to resolve problems. You know, we can't form a treaty with our opponent in chess. And like seeing like and its converse, xenophobia. So, you know, games where you kill aliens or orcs or anything are responding to this xenophobic impulse to fight the other, I guess. And yeah, it's like we're already getting into this conversation about which parts of game design are good and which parts of game design should we think about. And again, as I said, from my perspective, one of the most valuable contributions of this book isn't really helping you to become a better game designer in the craft sense, because there aren't many takeaways here that will teach you to do game design better. But I do think that this thread of ethics that runs through it is really, really strong. So there is a tone that can feel a bit scolding at points where it's like, oh, it kind of sucks that all games are about fighting, doesn't it? But it's very gentle. And I think really that the aim of these sections is just to, you know, assuming that the reader is a game designer or a budding game designer, just encourage you to think of the fact that games can be about different things and that you don't have to make a game about something that you find objectionable in everyday life just because, you know, quote unquote, that's what games are about. So, yeah, we get a lot of that. And then we get a section about how games can be about topology. So basically understanding shapes and space. So we've got a talk about get to the other side games, things like Frogger, Donkey Kong, Kangaroo. These are games where mastering a topology of, you know, moving a thing across a thing and understanding the differentiations between dangerous bits of ground and so on are those kind of things. And then another approach to topology in games is a visit every location game. So something like Pac-Man, where you're moving around a map and trying to get all the things on the map. And as gets constantly reiterated through this, that is a pattern that has persisted, right? So even when we play a 3D first-person AAA game now, you don't necessarily have to go and see every part of the map, but there is a bunch of stuff in place that sort of reinforces the idea that that's a good thing to do, right? And if you've ever played the Stanley Parable, you will know that the Stanley Parable makes various jokes about how games have entrained us to do that. So in the Stanley Parable, if you ignore the instructions and you go down a different route because your gamer brain tells you, you know, never go directly for the main objective, always take the side route, always look for all of the secrets and stuff like that, then, you know, that's what games generally want you to do. And the Stanley Parable sort of makes a joke out of that. I think a lot of this still stands the test of time, that these kind of topological games of cover all the space still exist. It's still a very dominant format, and you know, you can link some of that to gamers wanting to feel a sense of completionism about something. You can also link some of it to just production concerns of, if I build 100 places, I want players to have a reason to go to all of them that isn't just to sightsee and so on. And maybe there's an argument there that, you know, we should have secret places in games that don't reward you with a coin or a power-up and are just there to be interesting places to discover and so on. You know, and then, yeah, to make a game more difficult, sometimes we ask you to do it faster, sometimes we ask you to do it more thoroughly. There's a fantastic illustration on page 79, which is one of the few places in the book where, you know, this is an illustration I would have kept in if I was editing this to be just a text-only version, where we get like a lineage of the 2D shooter. So it's got Space Invaders and Galaga and Galaxian, and it shows all these little arrows of the kind of evolutionary movement of different mechanics between these games. Asteroids is on there, Space War is on there, a bunch of other ones I haven't heard of. And Koster kind of takes us through how different game mechanics go between these and permeate. So we've also got this genetic metaphor within games that Koster talks about as ludemes. It doesn't go super into depth about what ludemes are, but it's the same linguistic root as meme, the idea of a unit of information or a unit of culture that has a sort of genealogical spread between things in a culture or in a medium. So game mechanics in this sense are ludemes. They are like little bits of a game, and little bits of a game can go from one to the other. And that is why if you see a health bar made up of a couple of little hearts, and at some point you can get a heart container, you might trace that back to, say, The Binding of Isaac, and then you would be able to trace it back from there to The Legend of Zelda or something like that. And because games are kind of a language, and you learn from one game and then apply what you learned to another game, these are things that you can kind of pick up and then use again. And depending on who your audience is and what they've played before, they will come to whatever game you've got with this repertoire of stuff they've learned from previous games. And that's how we get gamers who are able to kind of manage the complexity of modern games, because there have been so many things that have built up their repertoire of game mechanics they can understand. Once we get up to chapter 5 of the book, we've got a chapter called What Games Aren't. And here we get a very dated beginning of a discussion about games and representational ethics, which feels quite dated. We talk about the Death Race game from 1976. We talk about Grand Theft Auto, and we get this kind of summary of the association between violent games and school shootings and all of that kind of stuff. And then Koster comes to bat for gamers here. He says there's a very good reason why the gamers are incredulous, and that is that we don't see the representation in the game. We see through the representation. So this whole section feels incredibly dismissive of some quite valid concerns that people have. So he sort of addresses those concerns, says he agrees with them, and then sort of dismisses them by saying that none of that stuff matters when you're playing a game. So quote here from 84, running over pedestrians, killing people, fighting terrorists, and eating dots while running from ghosts. They're all just stage settings, convenient metaphors for what a game is actually teaching. Death Race does not teach you to run over pedestrians any more than Pac-Man teaches you to eat dots and be scared of ghosts. None of this is to minimize the fact that Death Race does involve running over pedestrians and squishing them into little tombstone icons. That's there for sure, and it's kind of reprehensible. It's not a great setting or staging for the game, but it's also not what the game is really about. And feels like an approach where he's saying, I am interested in the game part of the game. I'm not interested in the story. I'm not interested in the representation. And because that's what I'm focusing on here, then the other stuff doesn't matter. And because I can see that there are gamers who don't see that stuff or see through it, it doesn't matter anymore. And that feels almost disingenuous to me, because if I'm playing a game about running people over, I am probably, at least in my first couple of playthroughs of that game, having a little giggle as I do it, because I'm doing something naughty. I'm doing something I'm not supposed to do. And if there wasn't that appeal there, I probably wouldn't be playing Death Race. I probably wouldn't be playing Grand Theft Auto, right? There's a reason why Grand Theft Auto appeals to the people it does appeal to, and why something like LA Noire, which uses the same game engine as GTA 4, doesn't appeal to the same group of people. And that is the transgression of doing the naughty thing you're not supposed to do. So sort of, I don't know, trying to bracket that off as just being not really what the game is about feels disingenuous to me. And again, it's part of this problem of trying to do formal game design thinking where you refuse to accept the role of representation in how the game is understood and received. And we get a dismissal of game stories here I'm trying not to read too much directly from the book, but I think some of these things have aged really poorly. So again, think of this is 2004 when this is being written. That might be when you were a baby, or it might have been when you were in your teens or whenever. I was a teenager in 2004, and Raph Koster says, there is also a current of game design which unapologetically puts story first. These are often powerful emotional experiences with relatively shallow game mechanics. This isn't a flaw, it's a deliberate design choice, but it doesn't speak to the kind of learning we get from game systems. By and large, people don't play with game systems because of the stories. The stories that wrap the systems are usually side dishes for the brain. For one thing, it has been rare to see a game story written by an actual writer. As a result, they're usually around the high school level of literary sophistication at best. And this is the kind of thing that feels like a sort of games industry professional being very self-aware about how games don't have very good stories. But I don't know, I'm thinking back to 2004. We had Final Fantasy VII. I would struggle to find anyone who played through Final Fantasy games that wasn't playing them at least partly for the story. And I guess maybe that's not the point he's making here. He's saying that, you know, the story might be a draw for you, but it's not what the game is. But I don't know, I find all of this kind of sneeringness towards game stories and, or maybe games could have good stories, but the ones we have are terrible kind of stuff I find that really, really unhelpful. And we also get a very brief discussion about the idea that games can be engines for stories, where one of the pleasurable things about playing a game is then as a player you develop stories of what happened during your playthrough. And this is one of the fun things about playing things like roguelikes, where a weird series of events happens and then you can tell other people about it. But we do get now a little bit more of a comparison between what games are and what stories are that I think is a little bit more helpful. So we've got a bullet point list here on page 88. Games tend to be experiential teaching. Stories teach vicariously. Right, so in a game, you learn about how something works by doing it. In a story, you see something happen to someone, and that is how you learn a moral or some sort of thing. Games are good at objectification, while stories are good at empathy. Not totally sure what is meant there, because the part of a game that is a story, I guess if you're thinking of like traditional cutscenes and stuff, you can separate these things out. But I just really cannot separate out a player character that kind of talks as a story device and I'm driving them around and playing with them at the same time. You know, at the time of the writing of this book, we have had several Silent Hill games. We have had a whole lot of Final Fantasies. We have had lots of games where you control a character who is also they're not just an avatar, they are a character, they are a story vehicle. And I find it very difficult to make this split between objectification and empathy that he's talking about here. Games tend to quantize, reduce, and classify. So putting things in categories, like simplifying things into data, I guess. That's part of the structure of them being a computer program, really. Stories tend to blur, deepen, and make subtle distinctions. I would say that's a characteristic of good stories rather than all stories. Games are external, they're about people's actions. Stories, or good ones anyway, are internal, they're about people's emotions and thoughts. Games are generators of player narratives, and stories provide a narrative. And again, you could say, well, when I play a game, I generate a narrative as a player. I can tell people I went over there, I got that, I killed the dragon, and then I did that, and then I got a really nice hat and I put the hat on. You can say that that's a narrative, and then the game still has its own narrative content as well. So again, some of these kind of hard splits just don't work for me. And I can understand why they are perhaps useful to do, particularly when you're talking to people about game design who have never really thought about it. And I think that is really something that pervades the whole book, is that this is written for an audience of people who have never seriously considered game design as a profession. It's written for an audience of people who love games and want to know how they're made and want to see games taken seriously in this format. And I think a lot of that is really feeding into this dismissal of how things are represented and the stories that games tell, and really the video game as a multimedia object. And I totally understand that when you're teaching someone game design, you often need to go back to chess or tic-tac-toe and go into this formalist mode for a little while and help someone to just understand rules and how rules lead to particular types of interaction and, players feeling particular ways. How can you make a player feel euphoric or frustrated or one of these emotions without it being related to a story or things happening to characters? I totally understand that you need to go back to that point at some point to teach like basic game design, but the video game as an object is not just an abstract set of rules. It is rules bundled up in all of these other audiovisual things, all of these other kind of story and representational things. And I struggle with this because I can see where it's coming from, and I don't think it necessarily goes anywhere good with it. On page 90, we finally get a definition of fun. So we've had a description of why we experience fun, of all of this kind of Evo psychology background of why we experience fun. And then we get a breakdown based on Nicole Lazzaro, talking about fun, where fun is the act of mastering a problem mentally. And then aesthetic appreciation isn't always fun, but it's certainly enjoyable. Visceral reactions are generally physical in nature and relate to physical mastery of a problem. So this is like, when you're playing a driving game and you sway around with the controller and stuff like that. Social status signals of various sorts are intrinsic to our self-image and our standing in a community. This is Nicole Lazzaro's definition of fun, which is like fun is just the mastering a problem mentally, and aesthetic appreciation, visceral reactions, and social status signals are things that we would relate to fun and sometimes misapprehend as being fun, but they're not fun in their own right. Like getting a trophy for winning something isn't fun. It's like an additional thing that gets added onto that. But yeah, like Koster really kind of leans in on the mastery is the only type of fun thing. And then we get a list of other types of things that we might things that we might put under this label sometimes, which again Koster believes are important sensations to understand, but he also gives them names and brackets them off. So schadenfreude, gloating at someone else's failure, fiero, which is the expression of triumph, fist pumping. We've got nachas, which is when someone that you are mentoring succeeds, kvel, which is bragging about someone you mentor and how good it feels to do that. These are all examples of things that feel good and which in some situations we might regard them as fun, but he's kind of defining them in order to bracket them off and say these things aren't fun. They're related to fun. They're things we might experience in a similar way, but they are not what fun is. So we get this very, very limited definition of what fun is that really is all laser honed in on this idea of fun being an evolutionary impulse to get better at surviving by being able to kind of master problems and spot patterns and all of these types of things. So we have these other things that we feel like nachas and quell, which are like social things to do with helping others and being a social creature. And yeah, these are all different things that we experience as fun because they give us positive mental feedback. So he puts them all together in one paragraph here. We get positive feedback for climbing the social ladder. We're just tribal monkeys throwing feces at each other in order to own the top of the tree. But notice some of the subtleties here. Climbing it while helping others. That's nachas and quell. Climbing it while pushing the boundaries of our knowledge. That's fun. Climbing it while strengthening our social networks, building communities and families that work together to improve everyone's lot. And these would be social behaviors like grooming, pairing, and feeding others. And then, as monkeys go, that's pretty darn good. In the general run of animals, it's amazing. It's a lot better than being a shark that only gets feedback for eating, right? So, all of this stuff about evolutionary psychology and stuff, it does at least feed into this idea that we are social creatures that want to help each other, right? But the other emotions that are sort of fun adjacent are the ones that are related to those social things, right? We get a list of other reasons you might play a game that aren't to do with fun. So practice, deliberate practice, trying to get better at something. And you're not really playing it for the enjoyment at that stage. So if you were training for an esport, you're not having fun. Meditation, which is the kind of idea of playing a game and zoning out because it puts you into a particular mind state. So very simple games like Tetris will often give you this. I get this with like bullet heaven type games where my brain just totally switches off. Again, this is not fun because we are not really learning anything new. We're playing something that we've perhaps already mastered, and we're not using it to do what Koster considers fun. We're using it to a different end of like getting into a meditative state. Storytelling comes into this category for Koster of things you can do with a game that are not fun. And again, remember, he's not saying this is not fun in the layman's sense of saying this is not enjoyable. He's saying, appreciating a story within a video game is enjoyable, but I've got this very kind of strict definition of what fun means, and in this context, this is not fun. For me, a lot of the problem of this book really comes back to the issue of taking an everyday word that everyone already uses in a bunch of ways and saying, no, it doesn't mean any of these things. It means specifically this. And that can be a very helpful exercise to do, to like bracket off a concept like fun and say, this is what fun actually is and these things aren't fun. Or to do that with games. Say, this is a game and, a visual novel is not a game. Actually, it's a form of literature or whatever. That can be a helpful exercise to do. But in terms of actually being able to enforce those definitions on anyone else in the world when you're trying to transform such a mundane everyday word, just seems unworkable to me. And I think one of the things that I kept thinking as I was reading through these definitions of fun is that if he'd have called it a theory of play for game design, and he said, well, actually, if you went through this book, Control F, changed every instance of the word fun with the word play, then it would all make total sense to me, because he's talking about playing. And yeah, appreciating a story isn't playing, but people have this understanding of the word fun as meaning lots of different types of enjoyment. And I don't think it works to try and take a layman's terms word and turn it into a very piece of like very specific academic or technical language, which is what he's trying to do here. And that just doesn't work for me, I think. I think the idea of this is why we play games, this is why we get the impulse to play games, and this is what we get out of it, and this is why we get bored with the game when we're done with it. All of that absolutely works to me. It's just, I think a lot of the time he's just talking about play or gameplay rather than specifically fun. For a long time since I've been teaching game design, whenever we approach the idea of design pillars, which is like, which experiential things is your game really about? Because a game can't be about everything, right? So a game that is about, building and exploring may then not be about certain other things, because you have to kind of bracket the experience to decide what you're focusing on. And one of the kind of tricks that I always use when teaching design pillars is to use the 14 forms of fun, which is a framework that is newer than this book. And it's just a list of different types of fun someone can get out of a game. And many of those contradict with Koster's definition. And I like that model because it speaks to the diversity of the different things that people find fun. And I just think the definition here is far too narrow, and trying to bracket off the enjoyment of like gameplay mastery from all the other types of enjoyment that you get while playing a game is perhaps just not productive. And it's also particularly unproductive to present this as if it's like a general rule for making good games, which again brings me back to the idea that this is really a set of reflections by someone who makes games about their kind of ethics of what a good game is, right? Rather than necessarily a book that really explains you how to do game design. It's how Raph Koster thinks you should do game design, and perhaps any instructional design book is a little bit like that. It's going to be the designer's values put into a book. But you know, I just think the way that the word fun is operationalized as a tool within this theory is the thing that I really struggle with. I think the general points that it makes throughout are quite helpful, but you know, that's really where my sticking point is with this. We do get an acknowledgement of people finding different things fun, right? And we get this idea that you know, there are just different types of games because there are different types of people, and there will be a certain type of game that you will just bounce off entirely, and that is just due to the diversity of human beings. So you will know people that will never play a puzzle game. You will know people who will never play an action game, and their kind of personality or whatever is geared towards particular types of fun, and all of that makes sense to me. But if that's the case, then why try and use this all-encompassing version of fun that is at the same time, you know, trying to cover the entirety of a particular type of human experience and trying to use the word fun in too many instances and make it really narrow at the same time. On page 126, we've got some stuff that really starts to kind of show Koster's values. And again, I this is the stuff I like. I like when it's written less like it's trying to be a sort of science book that is explaining why humans are a particular way, and starts just being Koster being like making declarative statements about what is a good game, because then it starts to read as more honest to me, when it feels more like it's just a designer telling you their thoughts about game design. So page 126, we get, not requiring skill from a player should be considered a cardinal sin in game design. At the same time, designers of games need to be careful not to make the game demand too much skill. They must keep in mind that players are always trying to reduce the difficulty of a task, and the easiest way to do that is to not play. Now that's actually really helpful advice, right? Of, if you make a game that is too easy, it ceases to be a game. If you make a game that is too hard, it's a game, but no one will play it. So, you know, in practice, it's not a game anymore. This is kind of stuff that starts to feel a bit more like practical game design advice. But you have to kind of go through, you know, 100 pages of Koster's ideas about why we play games to get here in the first place. And we get like a checklist here, which I think is quite useful as well. Where Koster says you can't have an algorithm for fun. You know, games are reasonably diverse. You can't just tick some boxes and people will have some fun. But he's got this checklist to check the game against, and see what you think about these, because I find this quite interesting or quite useful. So first one is, do you have to prepare before taking on the challenge? Can you prepare in different ways and still succeed? Does the environment in which the challenge takes place affect the challenge? Are there solid rules defined by the challenge you undertake or defined for the challenge? Can the core mechanics support multiple types of challenges? Can the player bring multiple abilities to bear on the challenge? At high levels of difficulty, does the player have to bring multiple abilities to bear on the challenge? Is there skill involved in using an ability? If not, is this a fundamental move in the game, like moving one checker piece? Are there multiple success states to overcoming the challenge? In other words, success should not have a single guaranteed result. Now, he doesn't make this distinction here, but I've seen other game designers like Keith Burgum where they create taxonomies of games versus puzzles versus challenges and stuff like this. And it feels like Koster is leaning in that direction here, because I think if you took this list of criteria and you took certain types of video games, like for example a rhythm game, where there's not really more than one way to play a rhythm game. It's just a series of commands, and if you don't do them at the right time, then you fail. A rhythm game, for example, would fail in Koster's definition here of a good game, because you cannot really approach it in different ways. When it tells you to press a button, all you can do to succeed is press that button. it's not like in most games, resolving a challenge is a sort of second order problem. So, for example, in a platformer, I've got to get from one side to the other, and there's stuff in the way stopping me. And the way I get past those things, like I don't have to jump on every enemy's head. And like in Mario, I can jump on the enemy's head, or I can bop them from below by hitting the blocks below them. There's lots of different ways I can solve the problem. And if you go through Koster's checklist here, those are the sorts of things that make a good game. It's like a diversity of the experience. And even in a very simple game, like something like Frogger or Pac-Man, moving at a different way at a different point creates this diversity of experience that means it feels like a game, rather than like just reacting to something and having to do the same thing every time, which would be kind of what things like rhythm games end up doing a lot of the time. Chapter 8 is called The Problem with People, and we start off talking about how game designers generally are aiming to make a game that has lots of different permutations in. A game that can produce emergent behavior where, the game can surprise us by having enough moving parts and enough different interactions that sometimes things will just emerge from the game that we don't expect. And if you think about what's been popular in recent years in game development, this is one of the reasons why we get so many indie roguelikes, right? If you look at it from a market point of view, it's like, oh, those things are popular. But as developers, we like to make those because it means the game that you're working on can surprise you as you're working on it, right? And we want that generally. In this section of the book, I think one thing that I noted, I've got a section here where I wrote underneath, this is Raph's design philosophy. It is not a generalizable theory of games and their function. So this is me responding to a paragraph where he says, making you feel good about yourself in a pretend arena isn't what games are for. Games are for offering challenges so that you can then turn around and apply those techniques to real problems. Going back through defeated challenges in order to pass time isn't a productive exercise of your brain's abilities. Nonetheless, lots of people do. And the thing is, I totally agree with this. We have a whole section here about power gamers and how, if you play a game that you're already way too good at in order to feel good about yourself, then you're not really playing games properly, and we shouldn't encourage that. I agree with everything he's saying here. The problem is that the whole book is sort of set up in this way that, the title of the book, the introduction of the book is presented as a sort of academic, analytic approach to game design. And a lot of what we get is really just an ethics of game design and personal reflections on the medium and some sort of directional stuff of what Koster would like to see game designers do more or less of. And I like it as that. It works very well for me as that. But that is not a theory of something, and to kind of set it up in this way of saying, here is what I think games should and shouldn't do. But to lead into that with this big kind of Evo psych thing about why humans feel fun and all of that, I just feel like there are two different books here and they don't quite go together for me. This kind of reflective designer talking about the ethics of game design is great, and I really like that element of this book. And I think, if there is a reason to read this book in this day and age, if you haven't read it yet and you're on the fence about it, then as a book about, a book of guidance on operating ethically as a game designer and trying to make the world a better place and having feeling proud of the profession you're in and all that kind of stuff. I think it's a very good book for that. I just think that there are parts of it that are at war with that aspect of the book because they are trying to present this much more scientific rationalist model of what games and fun are that just doesn't fit together with that more prescriptive kind of ethically driven thing for me personally. I've said throughout that this is quite a formalist approach to game design, right? Where Koster is interested in the structure of the playable part of a game. He's not so interested in the video game as a whole kind of holistic object that includes all of these other types of expression. He sees those things as secondary or not, at least not important to this question of what fun is in game design. And then we get into this description of like formalism, and he starts relating games to other types of art. Can games aspire to be art as well? Which again, it kind of feels like this is stream of consciousness stuff that I can't quite work out where it fits in the rest of this theory. We get this discussion of, can you make an impressionistic game? And the way he puts it here is, can you make a game where the formal system of playing the game conveys the following things? The object that you seek to understand is not visible or depicted. The negative space is more important than the shape. And that repetition with variation is central to understanding. So the idea here is he's giving us a definition of what an impressionistic art would be. And this could be art as in literature, it could be painting, but the idea that you're not depicting something directly, you're depicting something by its absence. And he's saying, if other media can do this type of indirect representation, that's kind of what makes them art. And one of the things I do agree with here is that he puts art and entertainment on a scale. He says they're not different things, they're just a difference in intensity. So art and entertainment often have the same contents and structure. It's just that art requires you to think more about what's going on in it, right? It doesn't tell you everything. And you could relate this to anything. You could relate it to a film, where, in a melodramatic Hollywood film, the characters state exactly what they're thinking, right? In a A24 art house film, you have to think about what's going on under the surface. Not everything is depicted, right? You're leaning more towards this impressionistic thing that he's described. And he's given us this set of bullet points and said, can you make a game like this that doesn't convey the thing it's about? And he says the answer is, of course you can. It's called Minesweeper, which is perhaps the best gotcha in the book. I quite like that. Again, some of this is a product of the time when this book is written, desperate for people to take games seriously and to think of games as belonging with all the other media, which is a totally, understandable goal. And, having taught games in the context of arts and humanities department, I still felt this in 2022, 2023, that video games were not taken seriously in this way. In order to get people to even consider taking them seriously, it was not enough for them to just be studied in this way. You had to attach them to something else. You had to make a video game about Hamlet, or attach some social benefit to games like games for health or games for education or something like that. This is something that continues on, and I think the impulse that we have to try and raise games up in this way is a noble one, but I think the sort of people that look down on them in that way are never really going to listen to it. So it's something that really we do for ourselves as a self-validation more than anything. But we've got a section here where we talk about the way games are very structured and rule-based, and maybe this is what makes them different from other types of media. And then he kind of just breaks down how every meter, fermata, key, note, tempo, colorature, orchestration, arrangement, scale, mode, these are all words for the rules of music. Color, line, weight, balance, compound, multiplied, additive, refraction, closure, model, still life, perspective, all words for the rules in visual art. So and then he is really into trying to write his zingers into this. Let's not kid ourselves, the sonnet is caged about with as many formal systems as a game is, right? So there's nothing formally about a game that means that it should be treated any differently from any other type of art form. It's really just the kind of associations that video games have earned with, being associated with children and trash culture that makes them be treated differently. And, I agree. Again, not sure where this fits into a theory of fun for game design. It's the framing of the book, again, is the thing that I keep finding an issue with. As a series of essays of someone reflecting on the medium, there are helpful, valid things said in every chapter of this book. I'm just not sure that they cohere into anything that is really a theory of fun that is usable for game design. Chapter 11 is called Where Games Should Go, and this is really where we get to the peak of this more ethical vein running through the book, which, like I said, I think is the stronger part of the book. And the idea here, I'm not sure which page he says this on, but he basically says, you know, there is this argument that games affect people, right? For better or worse. It's probably not monkey see, monkey do. You probably don't play GTA once and then go and murder people, but maybe they do. And he takes the stance that, you know, if games can have a good or bad effect on people, then as a designer, it's probably better if I assume that they do have an effect on people. Because if that turns out to be the case, then I won't have done any harm and I would have been striving to do the right thing. And if I just ignore that, then I might be doing harm without realizing it, which I think is a very sensible way of looking at the ethics of creating anything. And then he comes up with this metaphor that I think is very lovely, which is that a game is like a trellis. So if you think of a trellis, that things grow up, and the human being is the plant, and it is shaped by the trellis, right? So if you go to a school where you play baseball and football and stuff like that, it is going to shape you as a person into a particular way. And this has been the way that sports have been related to young people for a very long time. You know, American football, you know, the type of football that you play with your hands, there's all sorts of lessons in there about tactics and about, you know, stopping and planning and stuff like that are directly related to kind of American military culture and stuff like that. So the idea that games shape us, and because games shape us, we should be deliberate in how we use games, goes way back, predates video games. And I think this is a really nice way of thinking about the responsibilities of a game designer, I suppose. Getting back into sort of games educator mode in my head, one of the things I really despair at in the game development space, in the indie space, is one of those things would be developers who only ask what people want, right? What do people want, and not what they need, perhaps. And also developers that really follow the kind of AAA or free-to-play doctrine of like, how can I make my game as long as possible and as time-consuming as possible? I would really love it for game designers to respect people's time more. And I would really love it for game designers to come to the craft with an idea of what games should be and what and really kind of following this idea of people grow around your games, people can potentially change from playing your game in some very small way, and what type of thing is the game that you are giving them encouraging? That is really not going down the simple tabloid route of saying violent games make people violent or anything like that. It's saying thoughtful games make people thoughtful, perhaps. That would be like a counterpoint. It's not necessarily about the representational content of your game, although, you know, making a million games about drop kicking babies off of cliffs, probably not a net positive in the world. Really, he's kind of going down this route of just trying to nudge us into thinking about that and to take some sort of responsibility, not necessarily for like massive evils in the world, but just coming to the craft with a sense of games can be transformative, so why not try to build games that make people slightly better in some small way? So we've got this metaphor of the trellis, and then actually one of the funnier cartoons, it says often the plants escape the trellis, but this is not a credit to the trellis, it's a credit to the plants, right? So if you think of outgrowing a game when you're a small kid and you can't play noughts and crosses or tic-tac-toe anymore because you understand too well how it works, you have outgrown the trellis, you're beyond that, and you can play something else now. But it's got these two kids talking at school, and the girl is talking to the young man, and she says, I was playing this platformer last night and I was struck by the essential futility of history, the way in which past events recur. And he's saying, I'm late for class, and trying to get away from her. That one is very amusing. So I'm not going to go through like every remaining page in this book because I feel like we've run quite long on it, and hopefully everything I said will give you a good sense of whether or not you should read it. I think if you're serious about making game design your profession, then you should have read this book at some point. And if you've read it before a while ago, maybe you come back to it now, because I read this first about 10 years ago when I was sort of professionalizing myself. I just got into the industry, and I would probably gone on the internet and read a list of books game designers should read. And that's why it's so early in this podcast series, because it's, at the top of the recommended list still a lot of the time. But if we contrast this with Jesse Schell's Art of Game Design, which I'm going to talk about with a guest next month, that is much more of a book of here are things you can do as you think about the game you're currently working on, right? It's much more like a book of exercises and thought experiments you can do in relation to a particular game you're working on. This is not that. It is a book about why we play games, and it has some, what I feel are dubious, reductive claims about what fun is, why we experience fun. And I don't necessarily disagree with those claims, but they just feel a little bit too narrow for me. And the presentation of the book as being a theory of X just sets it up to be a particular type of perhaps more academic, less personal writing. And for me, it just jumps between these modes a little bit too much, where we start off with the anecdote about granddad and, I'm guilty about what I do at work because game design isn't like being a doctor or a teacher or something. How can I make game design sound better for my granddad? So, it's this very pop sci, popular science approach to talking about a deeper thing. And it is reasonably well researched, but we also get, 2004 is not the start of game studies. We have lots of game studies authors from before this point who are just not given a mention in here. There are various sections where he talks about Shakespeare, and he's talking about, high culture and comparing games to high culture. Not a single mention of Janet Murray's Hamlet and the Holodeck in this, which came out in, I don't know, 7 years before this, something like that. So it does feel like very well researched in terms of some of the claims it makes about the brain and certain forms of art, but there are also big gaps here in fitting this into like other writing that was going on at the time about games and how to design them and how to study them and all of that kind of stuff. So it's a very odd book, and like I said, I think in terms of what I take from it, the ethical element of how a game designer should think about what they're doing, and how a game designer should approach the craft of what they're doing, and the ethical considerations that come along with that. I think that is the strongest part of the book, and I think it's worth reading for those things alone. I also think that there is what it does in terms of trying to defend games or justify games versus a bunch of different criticisms against them still stands the test of time. There are still lots of people in the world who think this way about games, of them being kind of a trash medium, being for kids and stuff like that. I don't think it's ever that productive to enter into discourse with those sorts of people about that kind of stuff, but it can be a helpful thing to think through. And if you do find yourself in this position of, perhaps being surrounded by people that look down on what you do, then I think, as a kind of help, like almost having a friendly voice to say, no, what we do is serious, what we do is helpful, what we do is beneficial to people. It is a helpful book for providing that kind of commentary as well. But there is not a lot in this book that will tell you specific things that you need to do with a game you're working on in order to become a game designer. It is much more top level, and generally that top level stuff, I find the ethical stuff more interesting and helpful than the stuff about what fun is and why humans play games. So I have talked about this for more than an hour now, which is far too long for a solo podcast of someone talking about a single book. I hope you found something useful here. If you're listening to the version of this on YouTube, do drop a like on it. Leave a comment if you found anything particularly helpful or you object to anything I say. That's totally fine. If you're listening to this on one of the podcast platforms like Spotify or iTunes or anything, and you like what you heard here, you like the first episode where I was talking with Tom about the Spelunky book, please do leave a positive review on that. It will help other people to find the podcast. And as I said, moving forward, I'm going to be doing future episodes with a guest, and I think after the next one I might have a co-host who is going to hang around, which for the format of something like this is helpful because you get, you know, books related to each other, and you get a little bit more of like the reading list starts to get joined up in some way. So the plan really is we're going to cover a few of these books that are sort of central to the field. So the next time that this podcast comes out, we'll be looking at Jesse Schell's Art of Game Design. If you've never read The Art of Game Design, I wouldn't necessarily say you need to read it before that episode, but there is an app for it because Jesse Schell developed this sort of deck of cards that goes along with the book that's almost like a set of tarot cards where you can just draw them and they give you a random prompt of something to think about in relation to your game. It's called a deck of lenses, and I think there's an iOS app of it as well. And if you're listening to this because you're a game developer, you're working on games currently and you've never engaged with that, or you've read the book but you've never used the deck/app, I would really encourage you to get that. I think the app is free, and it will just give you a random card saying, have you thought about this thing in relation to your game? And that's why it's called a deck of lenses, right? It's ways of looking at a game from different perspectives. And I find that really, really helpful. I still use it occasionally now. And I highly recommend going and checking that out, even if you have no intention of reading the book. But yeah, moving forward, we're going to get into more of a conversational mode, which will be more like the episode we did last time with the Spelunky book, where I'm talking to someone else about it. And yeah, if you find this podcast helpful, leave us a good review, leave a comment, anything like that. It helps us keep going. Thank you to everyone who already contributes to my Patreon, patreon.com/Indie Game Clinic. You are responsible for me being able to do stuff like this. And for the weekly streams I do over on the Indie Game Clinic YouTube channel, where I play a series of games sent in by you folks who are still working on your games and review them live in the stream. And that is a joy to do. I'm really glad to be able to do it, but it is helpful that it has that financial backing as well, because I have to take time out from doing other stuff like freelance work in order to be able to do that. When I started that channel about a year ago now, it was initially all static videos. I've gradually transitioned to doing more stream-based stuff. And the streams have been fantastic because we have a kind of core audience of people who show up for the streams and who give feedback on the games as we're going as well. And I find that really helpful because, you know, kind of coming back to this book, I'm very wary of anything to do with game design that tries to present a universal theory of a thing. I'm much more comfortable when game designers sort of openly have a position, you know, a set of tastes, a set of personal ethics about games and what a good game is and stuff like that, and then their game is an expression of those things. I'm much more comfortable with all of that kind of stuff. And I think sometimes when I'm reviewing games and talking about game design, people really want me to take this sort of objective type view on things and say, you know, stick to the objective side of things, which I just don't think you can do with anything experiential. And one of the things that's so great about transitioning to doing streams rather than static videos is I have this chat there, they're feeding back, they're arguing with me about what they think about the games and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, lots of the people in those streams have been making games just as long as I have, maybe have worked on more games, released more games. So it's just a fantastic community because instead of just making a video on my own, reviewing someone's game and talking about game design principles, I get to do it live. And as long as my internet service provider doesn't keep cutting me off like they did a couple of months ago, long may that continue. So thanks to everyone who's already helping me out with that, who's already joined the Indie Game Clinic Patreon, joined the Discord community, all of that kind of stuff. you're really helping me to, well, make the content in the first place and make it so that it's not just me rabbiting on about my own positions and values on things, because that's really all that any game design talk is. And if you try and be too objective about stuff, you just end up coming up with all these caveats and going, well, you know, this type of person might like your game more if you did this, but if you did this, then this type of person might like your game more. And, you know, I really am of the opinion that design is about having a perspective and a stance and articulating it through what you do and what you make. And just as I've said multiple times about this book, I really think Raph Koster is at his strongest when he is kind of preaching almost about what he thinks a good game is and what he thinks game designers should do and what he thinks games shouldn't do and all of that kind of stuff, when it feels more like a heartfelt subjective treatise on these things rather than an attempt at sort of scientifically explaining humans and why we do what we do. I find that much more compelling. But, you know, perhaps that's just me, but let me know what you think, and tune in next time. Thank you for joining me for this long, rambling examination of a book that I enjoyed coming back to after all this time.